I'm planning a maximum bang for buck build at the moment, and I really want to put a Ryzen 3000 CPU in it and get in on that hot Zen 2 action. Now, normally when I'm building an AMD rig and the budget doesn't really want to stretch it up to an X470 board, my normal choice is the Gigabyte B450 DS3H. And it's a really good value for money micro ATX motherboard with the B450 chipset, which is a really good all-rounder. It's not quite as high spec as the X470, and obviously X570 is still pretty pricey these days, but it's a very good compromise. And the DS3H also makes up for this really well by having 4 RAM slots, which is also really good for what is barely above a budget motherboard. And it does all of this while still being more or less cheaper than everyone else that you'd actually want to consider using. However, I'm doing this build as a demo PC, so I kind of want it to look kind of fancy, so I wanted to use something a little bit more upmarket than the DS3H. And while there are a lot of boards out there that are B450 gaming motherboards, they all seem to have some kind of drawback that really put me off. That was either they only had 2 RAM slots, or they were charging like sort of, up to £100 for a B450 motherboard, and that's getting, like £100 will get you an X470 board, albeit a low end one. So I wanted something that was a bit better value for money than that. But just as I was about to give up and put a DS3H in the basket anyway, I spotted the Gigabyte B450 Aorus M for just £84 on Amazon, which I then got for about £74 from Amazon Warehouse in exchange for not getting a retail box. So let's take a closer look. So at first blush, I thought that this was just a DS3H with a paint job on it. It certainly shares a lot in common with the DS3H, but the more you look at it, the more you realise that it's actually built up to be a completely different animal, and it's been crammed full of a lot of stuff that really bridges the gap between just a bog standard B450 motherboard and more or less a not too shabby X470 board. So let's have a tour around this thing and take a look at what it's got, and then I'm going to have a quick chat about how that compares to the DS3H, which was my low-cost alternative, and also how it compares to a couple of other boards that are out there as well. As usual, I'm going to start with the power system, and unlike previous videos, we're going to take a slightly deeper dive into this one, because if it's one thing I've learned after reviewing the past, 5 or so motherboards, that it's not enough to just take things at face value anymore. You've got to actually really look closely to find out what exactly they're doing with the board and how that creates a better or worse setup for the computer. So we've got an impressive row of 8 inductors plus another 3 for the auxiliary rails. But despite the number of inductors here, this is actually a 4-phase setup with 2 inductors per phase. And then we've got our 3 auxiliary phases up on the top row. So there's 3 underneath this heatsink, and there's an extra phase up here as well. There's 3 sets of triple MOSFETs underneath the heatsink, and then the extra one is up the top there. And if Gigabyte is to be believed, then they're fairly beefy MOSFETs as well, which should be running a little bit more efficiently than some poor man's MOSFETs that you would find on a cheaper board, such as the DS3H. So I'm expecting to get more efficiency and thus less heat from those MOSFETs. Phases 3 and 4 are also PWM controlled, and that creates what Gigabyte calls its hybrid digital power system, where the 3rd and 4th phase can actually be switched on and off by the CPU. And this means that it can then increase or decrease the amount of power delivery to improve overall power efficiency to the system by switching off phases that it doesn't need because it's idling. This is all being handled by an Intersil 95712 controller, which again is only a 4-phase controller. It's good for over 160 watts. So despite the low phase count, this board is more than happy with anything up to a mid to high end chip. Although obviously it's not going to fare very well if you put in the really top end chips. But if you can afford those, you can afford a better motherboard than this. Moving over, we've got 4 DDR4 slots which do latch at both ends, and we've got 6 SATA 3 connectors with a block of 4 there and 2 of them here, although bearing in mind that you're probably going to lose one of these connectors if you have a SATA-based SSD in your M.2 slot. However, if you need to connect up 6 hard drives to a micro-ATX computer, I think you might have other priorities than that. Then we've got an Aorus logo on the modest heatsink on the B450 chipset. This doesn't light up or anything, but this whole section of the board is probably going to get covered up by your graphics card anyway, so I don't think that particularly matters. In the PCI Express department, we've got a PCI Express 16 slot, a 1x slot, and a 4x slot masquerading as a 16x slot. So don't be deceived by this being full length. There's actually only pins up to 4x in there. So ignore this thing. I'm not sure why they bother putting these full length slots on them. Maybe just for pimp value or something like that. Then nestled in between them, we've got our M.2 connector, which comes with a natty little heatsink as well. Although it's kind of debatable as to whether these heatsinks actually do anything, but I'm actually planning an upcoming video where I look into that myself, because it's indisputable that NVMe SSDs can kick out a lot of heat, and that heat will cause them to slow down over time, but it is quite debatable whether that actually makes any difference in a gaming computer or not, since theoretically an NVMe drive is fast enough that you're finished with whatever you're doing before it actually heats up. Around the back of the board, we've got HDMI and DVI, which can be used if you're using an AMD APU, such as the 2200G, 2400G, or 3400G. These will not work if you don't have one of those G chips on it. And then they are surrounded by 8 USB connectors. We've got a couple of USB 2.0s, a big stack of 4 USB 3.0s, and then we've got a pair of USB 3.1 USB headers as well. There's no C-type connector, however, it's up to you whether that's an issue or not. Additionally, there is no C-type front panel header either. So if you've got a brand new case with a C-type connector on its front panel, there's nowhere to hook that up in here. You're going to need to use an adapter or some such. The audio is nothing particularly to write home about. We've got 7-channel audio with the 7-channel output as well at the back, which again, some of the B450 motherboards don't have this. And they've put on 4 Nippon Chemicon capacitors on it as well. So they actually put a little bit of thought into this, not a huge amount, but it's there, it'll function, and it'll absolutely be fit for purpose. While I haven't done extensive testing myself, I would wager that you're going to have to spend a significant amount of money on your headphones or your audio setup before you'll see any real difference between this and a fancy audio setup. Headers on this board are a bit of a mixed bag. As I mentioned earlier on, we've got no USB-C type header on this. However, we do have a 3.0 header and we do have 2 USB 2.0 headers as well. And these guys are really useful for connecting up your water cooling, RGB controller, fan controller, that kind of thing. It is surprising how many boards only have a single double header there, which can often turn into a problem on builds with lots of accessories in them. But the real thing that I think this board is lacking is fan connectors. There's actually only 3 of them that I've found so far. There is 2 system headers in the top left and top right of the board and a single CPU fan connector. So really, if you're using a case that has a selection of fans on it, such as, front RGB fans or anything like that, you're going to need some kind of dedicated controller. So either the case will need to have a built-in fan hub, or you're going to need some kind of standalone controller setup. If it's one thing that the Aorus branding does deliver on though with this motherboard, that is RGB headers. So we've got 2 digital RGB headers, one down the bottom here and one up in the top right. And there is another one over here next to the CPU that's designed to be hooked up to a Wraith Max RGB cooler that would come with the higher end AMD chips. However, I would wager you could probably repurpose that for other things if you wanted to, because to my knowledge, this is just a standard digital RGB header. However, I'll probably be looking into that another time. In addition to the digital ones, we do also have an analog RGB header down here as well for plugging in just dumb RGB LED strips. So you can use that to create just a wash light in the case. And the digital RGB headers do also have the 12 or 5 volt selector on them as well. So there's a lot of good options there for hooking up your LED stuff. The disadvantage of this, of course, is that you have to use Gigabyte RGB Fusion, which I'm not a massive fan of. However, considering the state of something like NZXT CAM right now, I'm beginning to think that RGB Fusion isn't all that bad. At the very least, a lot of this stuff you can do a basic setup from within the BIOS, such as just setting a flat color. So if you just want to set all of your LED lighting to just a fixed color, such as, white or blue, or just a single spectrum color, or even just spectrum wave, you can do all of that from within the BIOS on most of these motherboards without even having to run the RGB software. Finally, we've got another couple of nice to haves as well. We do have dual BIOS on this board, which is particularly useful because these AM4 motherboards are the kind of boards that you'd actually want to do a BIOS update on to add in additional CPU support, such as Ryzen 3000. And we do also have a pre-boot LED indicator down here. So if you're stuck in no post hell, you've actually got some LEDs to give you a vague idea on what might be wrong with the system. So how does this board compare to other boards in the same kind of price bracket? Because that's the important thing after all. Well, as of the time of writing this review, this board actually costs about £100 or so, but this one was on sale on Amazon from £100 all the way down to just over £80. And then I jumped onto Amazon Warehouse and got this one open box for just over £70. And that makes it fantastically good value for money, because a DS3H is going to cost you about £65 or so, and most of the other competitor boards are easily sort of around about the £80 or £90 marker. So at recommended retail price, this thing would be kind of too expensive for a B450 board. It's got the same price tag as a low-end X470 board. However, apparently because of the age of the B450 chipset, these things are really coming down in price now. So I would wager you could probably pick one of these up on the cheap, like I have. So if you wanted to go even lower than that, the DS3H is a good board, but it lacks a lot of the creature comforts that this thing has. It doesn't have the 7.1 channel output at the back, it doesn't have the dual BIOS, and it also doesn't have the other gamer toys like the RGB headers. It's also got one less fan header, which creates even more of an issue for a fan setup. It's got the same 4+3 setup, but it only has 2 FETs per phase, and those MOSFETs are not the fancy ones either, which means they're going to be less power efficient and potentially less stable. So that is, again, not going to be an issue for lower end CPUs, but it means you can't get away with putting the stronger CPUs in it and expect to have that rock solid stability. So really, this board versus the DS3H is a perfect example of quality versus quantity when it comes to VRM setup. As an alternative board, MSI have got the B450 Gaming Plus, which is also in the same kind of price bracket, and it does look really nice as well with all the red branding on it. However, you've only got 2 RAM slots there, it's got cheaper audio, and it trades out 2 of its rear USB ports for a second USB 3.0 front header. And I don't think that's particularly useful because, I can't remember the last time I saw a micro ATX case with 4 front USB 3 headers. That's not something that you see about. And on top of that, it's not going to have that dual BIOS either, which again, is a nice safety net to have if you're in the habit of messing around in the BIOS quite often. The strongest contender that I could find was the ASRock B450 M Pro 4. And this is a really interesting board because they've crammed 2 M.2 connectors onto it, which is a really nice feature to have for people who can't afford a big SSD at the time of build. Because you can start off with a modestly sized SSD and add in a second M.2 SSD later on down the line and keep both of them at the same time. And that's something that is exactly what I'm doing with my computer at home. They've also put in their own implementation of dual BIOS, and they've got a USB-C type connector at the back, which again, I think is really important to get us out of this chicken and egg situation that USB-C is in. However, the thing that puts me off that board is that it's got kind of crappy audio considering the rest of the board's setup. And in addition to that, I always find that ASRock are maybe a little bit sketchy in terms of reliability. Suffice to say, I would trust a Gigabyte board a lot more than I would ASRock as a brand. However, if you can't get hold of the Aorus M in your region, or if it's not on the same decent price point that I bought mine for, that B450 Pro 4 will be a really, really good alternative to this. Another thing I did notice as well was that the Aorus M has swapped the M.2 connector and the PCI Express 16 slot around to put it slightly higher up on the board. This means your graphics card is going to be possibly about an inch higher in the case, and in a microATX case where you've got about that much space for your graphics card, that's going to make a big difference to cooling. And that is when you actually build in a microATX case with that height restriction in there, you'll see what I mean, and you'll be quite thankful for that extra inch of space. Okay, all that said, let's power this thing up and have a look in the BIOS and see what it looks like in a built computer. Okay, so I've got my test set up on the bench all done now. Now, I was going to put in a little montage about me updating the BIOS for Ryzen 3000 support. However, while I was shooting the B-roll footage for that, it actually turned into a world of hurt like I've never seen trying to do a BIOS update on a motherboard. Now, I could point fingers at what I think went wrong while doing this, but I will leave that to a separate video that I'm going to make about what went wrong when I was updating this motherboard. The long and the short of it is, the Gigabyte website advises you to update the BIOSes sequentially. I had version F2 on this, and the Gigabyte website advises in red text following the notes that you must do sequential updates on it. So the obvious answer was to go to BIOS version F32. Then I would have to potentially do some firmware updates. Then I could go up to F41, and then I could go up to F42, and so on. And so I put on F32 and soft locked the motherboard. However, when I actually got all of that fixed and I jumped straight up to F41, all of the problems disappeared and we got on track. So long story short, if you get this motherboard, ignore what the Gigabyte website says, just flash it up to F41 and you'll be fine. So I'll leave the rest of that to the other video. In the meantime now, so we're now sitting in the BIOS and we've got our Ryzen 5 3600 detected and working. We've got 16 gigs of RAM and I'm driving my RAM at 3400 megahertz, which is what it's rated for. So this was where another issue came up. The first thing I did was, while I'm sitting here in easy mode, I clicked on XMP profile and I set it to XMP profile 1, save and exit setup, and it immediately wouldn't post. Had to reset to the default BIOS settings. So again, bad start once again, reasons why I hate using XMP profiles. But once I went into the classic mode, I went into advanced memory settings and I turned on XMP profile from here. I set it to profile 1, level 1, and then everything clicked into place, restarted the computer again, and now we're sitting pretty at 3400 megahertz, which is absolutely ideal for a Ryzen 3000. So that was all hunky-dory. So with that in mind, we'll have another quick look around the motherboard. So obviously in the memory profile here, I can switch all of this stuff onto manual and tweak my memory to my heart's content if I want to. I'm not going to. I've got it onto the speed I want. We're going to leave it the heck alone. In the advanced frequency settings, we start off with a nice simple interface where you can just do a couple of simple tweaks, or if you want to, you can dive into advanced CPU settings and you can start drilling into all of this stuff as well. And likewise, at some point, we're going to make sure that core performance boost is, that's already set to auto. So our boost on all cores is already on by default, which is nice. And then in addition to that, we do also have just some quick memory multiplier settings in the same place as the CPU settings. So if you want to do just some quick headline adjustments, you can do that just in advanced frequency settings. So there's a little bit of repetition in this BIOS, but it's actually quite logically laid out. And likewise, we got our voltage settings in there as well. There's not a huge amount in there, but I'm sure there's everything that is required if you want to get serious with these things. So in the PC health department, we've got some basic information there, not a whole lot. All of our fan settings and stuff is all going to be sitting down in SmartFan 5 here. And if we go into that, we get the SmartFan 5 interface and we can pick out which which interface we're monitoring. So we've got CPU fan, sysfan 1 and sysfan 2, and we can select what thermal input it's using to measure that fan against. We can change whether we're using some built-in profiles, silent, manual, full speed, and we can also set up the adjustment interval. We can manually change between voltage or PWM control and all of that kind of thing. We do also have a fan start-stop mode as well, which is nice. So you've got basic temperature setups in here that are perfectly fine, quite frankly. Got no issues with those at all. So then if we go over to system, we've got the basic system stuff, BIOS versions, system date, time, etc, etc. We've got some other BIOS options as well, including boot options and that kind of thing. Peripherals, all your peripheral stuff. What I really want to get into here is our LED settings. So yep, we can set whether LEDs turn off in sleep mode and things like that. So you can choose whether you want those to stay off all the time or not. Have we got RGB fusion? We do. There we go. So we've got RGB fusion as well. So that from here, I can pick out what colors are being broadcast on the RGB headers. So in this case, I'm just going to change mine over to red, I think, just because we got some red accents going on in this computer. So I'll set red, and let me see. Can you guys see it? And over in the bottom right there, you can see that our audio circuit is now turned red. That's the only LEDs I've got hooked up to this thing at the moment, and they're not going to be very visible behind the graphics card, but it's there, now you know where it is. So you can do your basic RGB setup without having to do any software configuration at all. And then finally, over in chipset, we can set up our SATA stuff, SATA hot swapping as well. We've got our power settings, including ERP on or off. So ERP is something that you might want to turn on, because if you've got, for example, an RGB mouse or a keyboard with a backlight, you might find that your mouse LED stays on even when your computer is turned off. That's because on a normal USB setup, your USB ports will output voltage to charge things even when the computer is turned off. And that means that your mouse light will stay on because the mouse still has power. If you switch on the ERP settings, that turns on the energy saver settings, which switches off the USB ports when the computer is turned off, and it makes sure it kills any peripherals while you're not using it. So that's always something nice to turn on. Past that, everything else looks hunky-dory in here. We've got boot override, so you can just quickly select where you want to boot from without having to change your boot order, so that's all nice as well. Other than that, the BIOS is pretty standard really, no complaints there whatsoever. So with all that in mind, I'm going to get this thing built into a computer and we can see what it looks like once it's in a case. Now we've got the board into a build, we can see that the high PCIe slot placement that I mentioned really does make a difference, and the large width of the board helps fill out the case nicely. From a feature standpoint, the Aorus M has done exactly what I was looking for by providing the feature set of an X series chipset at the price of a B series. While some very specific memory timings and voltage controls remained hidden from me, I was able to explore the world of Ryzen overclocking with this setup. But on a more sour note, the reliability of the BIOS continues to be an issue. Even on the absolute latest F42 BIOS, the board is fickle and it'll reset to the defaults if something as trivial as being unplugged from the mains and carried across the room happens. If you intend to buy this board for appearance and bragging rights for the brand, you can run it as stock and never have a single issue with it. But if you're the type to keep fiddling with your build, the spotty BIOS reliability is likely to become your main enemy. And that's a shame, because this is exactly what I jabbed the ASRock board earlier on for. In any case, thanks for watching everyone. I've got more content for this build in the pipeline, so let me know what you think in the comments and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.